Good evening, everyone. I'm Amelia.
I'm Tom.
We're in Dayton, Ohio, and today we're coming to you on June 9th with a story from Matthew 9, which Tom will tell you.
So this is the story. Jesus went about in all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the kingdom of heaven, and curing every sickness and every disease. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them. And for they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And he called his disciples to him and said, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." And then he called the 12 to him and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to cure every disease and every sickness. And these are the names of the 12 apostles. There was Simon, who was also called Peter, and his brother Andrew. James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Philip and Bartholomew. Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector. James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus. Simon, the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. Then Jesus sent them out with these instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles, and enter not into any of the cities of the Samaritans, but go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You received without cost. Give without cost.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, so this story starts off kind of describing Jesus's ministry. He teaches, he proclaims the kingdom, and he cures every sickness and every disease. So it's interesting that, the first two facets of his work have to do with kind of the same thing, I guess, teaching and proclaiming the kingdom. And those of us who go to church a lot, we sort of assume we know what the kingdom has to do with, but I'm not sure we really do. How would you understand what Jesus means by the kingdom?
Well, it is a term that has a long history. There were, throughout the history of Israel, references to the kingdom of Saul, the kingdom of David, the kingdom of Solomon, so on. So it was, first of all, a governmental So there were hopes from the 7th century until Jesus' time for the restoration of the kingdom of David. But this kingdom of heaven is a reconception of the character of a government. And this is about the good news of a spiritual kingdom in which the powers of heaven, the powers of God, would be in control. And one of the signs of that was that evil spirits, unclean spirits, would be cast out and would not have any more power. So the sign of the good news of the kingdom was that people who were harassed by kingdoms of this age, that is, the kingdom of Rome, would be set free. And that the kingdom of heaven then would be a new age in which there would be freedom and peace, equality, a time of good news.
Well, you mentioned that word harassed. And that line, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless. And then you talk about this great vision of the kingdom being, all these wonderful things. In these days where not only our country, but around the world, there are calls for basically the kind of things you're talking about in terms of the kingdom of God, that has some equality, because there are so many people of color in this country, African Americans, this long history of being harassed, to put it mildly, and seemingly helpless to change their situation because they have not had the power in a racist culture that we have here. Whites have the power. So do you hear the stories being relevant for our times today as well as for 2,000 years ago?
The vision that is implicit in this story is that these powers of the kingdom of heaven are powerful then and now. Part of what is happening is that the implementation of nonviolent resistance to the powers of this evil age are once again being tested and brought to bear. So this tension between the powers of the old age and the powers of the new age, the powers of the kingdom of this world and the powers of the kingdom of heaven, is a conflict that has been going on. But the proclamation of Jesus and of the apostles is that the kingdom of heaven is drawn near and that there is hope for the establishment of the powers of this new age. And it is especially directed to those who are harassed and helpless. When I say that word, I think of George Floyd, who was helpless and could not defend himself against this policeman who had his knee on his neck. That's the kind of oppression that Jesus saw, and that then moved him to compassion, and then to ask for his disciples to go out and be then laborers in the vineyard of the kingdom of heaven.
Right. Okay, thank you. Another question I have about, we'll write what happens next, is this verbal thread that Jesus cured every sickness and every disease, and then sent his disciples out to do the same thing.
Yep.
Which, sounds wonderful. We'd all like that. And especially in this day with the pandemic. But I worry, is this kind of thing what's behind some churches where pastors are saying, come to church, God will protect us from getting the virus. So I'm concerned about how Jesus's words and actions and what he called his disciples to do, how that might be interpreted in these days.
Yeah, well, there's what this implies in this context is that Jesus was doing a new and distinctive thing. Never in the history of Israel was there someone who would cure every disease and every sickness. That is, that a ministry of health care would be central to the mission and actions of a prophet of Israel. So Jesus of Nazareth is a distinctive figure in the degree to which healing and health care for people who were sick and diseased would be able then to get help and would be able to get care. So this is something that Jesus distinctively set in motion as a part of the mission of his followers that the church has developed over the ages and has been a primary agent. So Good Samaritan Hospital is where I was born. Had an emergency appendectomy and open heart surgery. So I am very grateful for this tradition of healthcare that Jesus established and that his apostles then set in motion.
Yes, I am as well. Nothing as serious as you've had, but I was born and I have had surgery. So I'm glad for the hospitals systems. Okay, so Jesus also talked about casting, or he didn't just talk about it, he did it, and he sent his disciples out to cast out demons. Now, that's not something that we hear about a whole lot, except, oops, I lost you. Okay. Well, there was a movie when I was growing up called The Exorcist. That's kind of a classic movie about demon possession. But really, we don't hear about that a whole lot, except maybe in metaphorical terms. Anyway, what was Jesus talking about with regard to casting out demons?
Yeah.
Or what did that mean? What was the significance to Matthew?
Yeah. This is related to this two ages worldview. And so there were people who were possessed by spirits that they could not control, that were unclean, that made them sick. So I would regard now people who are addicted to alcohol and to drugs as being possessed by an unclean spirit that is killing them. And so but it was also that they were subject to powers beyond their control that were controlled by the people in power. And so they would regard then people who would even protest as having an unclean spirit. But these unclean spirits that Jesus is identifying are the things that connected persons to this system of oppression. That was the dominance of the powers of the old age. that would then subject people to a spirit that was destructive to them. And so casting out and having authority over unclean spirits was that Jesus and his apostles were able to set people free from that domination by spirits that were out to destroy them.
Well, that's a freedom we would all really appreciate having. So maybe the story can help us with that. Okay, so last week's story was the Great Commission, where Jesus told his disciples to go out and make disciples of all the nations. And you explained that nations is sort of was code word for Gentiles, who had been the historic enemies. All of various Gentiles were enemies of Jesus's people. So that story was at the end of the Gospel of Matthew. This one's not exactly the middle. It's closer to the beginning. It's really the beginning, I think, of Jesus's work and getting his followers to do the work that he would have them do. But here he says, don't go to the Gentiles and don't go to the Samaritans even. So did Jesus change his mind? Did he get a new word from God? What's going on here, do you think?
Part of the problem that we have is that we skip around in the gospel and don't hear it as a whole. And so the development that happens in the course of the gospel is that the mission of Jesus initially is focused on his ethnic people, the people of Israel. And so it's also the case, I think, that the audiences of Matthew were overwhelmingly Judeans. They are addressed, the audiences of the Gospel of Matthew are addressed as Judeans, as Israelites, as Jews. And so this initial focus on the mission of the disciples to the lost sheep of Israel is then a promise. It's a sign that the kingdom is first of all for those who have been oppressed for 600 years by various Gentile rulers. And so this is a promise of the possibility of a new life. Over the course of the gospel, Jesus does do an increasing number of good things for his enemies, for Gentiles, for people on the other side. But it is not until the end of the gospel that he commissions the disciples to make disciples of all the peoples, of all the nations, of all the Gentiles. The word that is used here is the same word that is used in the Great Commission, ethnoi, from which we get ethnic. So people of every ethnicity then were at the end the object of the mission, of the commissioning of the disciples at the end of Jesus' presence on the earth.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I guess I have one last question about the very last line in this story, which in the NRSV, my translation, it says, "You receive without payment, give without payment." I think you said we received without cost, give without cost. Now we're both clergy, and I have to say, I really appreciate receiving something for, my work with the church, and but the church does rest mostly on the work of volunteers. But I also think, did Jesus really? What's going on there? Should we not expect those of us who work for the church, and actually it wouldn't just be church laborers, it would also be all the medical professionals, because much of what Jesus did was to heal and to cure and to cast out, demons and all of that. I mean, should they not be expecting to be receive any payment for their labors? What do you think about that last sentence there, that last
Yeah.
phrase?
Well, I think first of all, it's an instance of needing to take account at first step of what it meant in its original context. What Jesus was doing was establishing a ministry of itinerancy, of itinerant disciples who would go and live off the land. They would go into a town and preach. He talks about that, that if a town receives you, then stay in that house. But if they do not, dust off your, leave the town. So he was establishing and training his disciples to be out and about and to have no hesitation about being dependent for a place to stay, place, food to eat, and that itself was a sign of the kingdom of heaven, of being an agent of God's kingdom of heaven, where good things are free, and that they can give these gifts of the kingdom of heaven, give them away free, just as they received them free. These spiritual gifts are not can be quantified in money. They're gifts of the Spirit, and so this was a sign of that. And there are various ways in which we live that out, but always there is this that is in the background, this initial impulse of Jesus and with his disciples.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you for watching us this, well, I don't know if it's evening when you're watching it, but anyway, it's always good to be with you, and we always appreciate hearing feedback. Nice to know that our efforts make any difference at all to people who are out there. So God bless you all.
Yeah. And tell the story.
Yeah. Amen.